The first timber industry started in Kyogle was the cedar industry in the mid-1800s. The original cedar was felled and rolled in manually into rivers till the flood come, and then they were washed down and captured either at Casino or Wardell to be loaded onto ships. When people got more affluent, they purchased bullocks, and then they could snig logs further to the river. Then they loaded wagons to get them quicker, and they took them to the drop over below Casino where the wharves were those days to be loaded on the ships. So our first method of transport was river. Then later, of course, just as I just said, bullocks carted timber on roads, so road was our next means of transport. And then later our timber was then shifted by rail. So river, road and rail, that's how this all began. There's a lot of stories told about why cedar boomed like it was. It was a fact that it was easy to fall because the wood was soft. It would float. A bullock could pull a log 3 times bigger than he could hardwood. So supply and demand, the cedar got the name as red gold and was exported to Japan, England, New Zealand, all over the world from these regions. But anyway, the next industry, of course, was hoop pine for house construction because it was also light, and most hoop pine logs floated, not all. They first used axes, of course, and when people got a bit more affluent, they could afford to buy a cross-cut saw. And in the early days, you worked with 2 to 4 men in a gang those days. And as time went on, it got down to 2 men, one pulling each end of the cross-cut saw. And then after the war, Second World War, people got a lot smarter and they used various methods to use on the other end of the cross-cut saw, and it's called a dead man or a dummy. Dummy meaning you're not having to pay for him, he's just on the end helping you. And one was 2 shark fish hooks with a push bike tube, and you hooked the one hook into the end of the cross-cut saw, the other end, and you hooked it around the tree, and that held the saw on the tree and stopped it from flopping about. Many fellas start at the age of 11-year-old using broad axes because father might have died and the eldest son had to provide for the rest of the brothers and sisters and mother, and same if there was only girls in the family. Girls started working on dairy farms at 10 and 11-year-old to keep a family together, and I went swinging a broad axe at 14-year-old. Sleeper cutting and girder cutting and poles and piles. Piles are for bridges and wharves, and poles, of course, for telegraph and electric light lines. That was a very big industry, and it was all done with broad axes. We had camps, areas around here with up to 30 men in a camp in the bush. 2 mile down McIntosh's Road in a big holler in the ground, and they called it Frosty Flat. The first mill, the Dennises come here and built a mill at Rosebery in 1895, but the biggest milling company in this area, of course, was Munro and Levers, and they bought a mill at Terrace Creek and started operating in 1911. They then started a mill at Gavilia, but Munro and Levers probably made this valley successful as what it was due to the amount of mills they built. Their operation up there initially wasn't cedar, it was all hoop pine, and then some white beech, and then eventually all the different softwoods and then hardwoods they operated. And the 1954 flood destroyed that mill, so they brought it to town. And they used to make butter cases, and all the butter cases them days are stamped either end, all the various butter companies. Yeah, all the butter cases made out of hoop pine because they didn't taint the butter and turn it a crazy colour. And the byproduct of that, and the Kyogle Creamery was the first butter factory in the world to export butter to another country.
They were loaded on rail when the rail came through. Early stages they actually went by horse team to Casino. They went from there. But then when the rail came to Kyogle, they used to bring cool trucks in, as they call them. Early days, all the logs that came in there were by bullock team in the Gavilia mill. But a lot of timber, sawn timber, used to come down to a place called Wyangry. It was a railway siding there, and they actually loaded a lot of it there. Sleepers were very common there. People cut sleepers for the railway. With the changing of the time and that, and machinery and everything, things got speeded up. They were doing dressing timber at Gavilia. You could get timber shape whatever size you wanted, whatever shape you wanted. They had a big planer there with about 3 men working full time on it. But in the early days up there, the roads were just tracks. The river was a series of big water holes. And there was no room for boats, because within every quarter mile, half a kilometre, there was crossings where the wagons went through the river.
And them days there was no restriction on width. They could load them trucks up to 14 foot wide, and they built these crude trailers to go behind them, solid wheel trucks of course, with carbide lights. Hit a bump, the lights go out. But one of the old drivers, Ern Smith, told me years and years ago, on good weather, it was a 7-day trip with a load from Gavilia to Byron Bay and home again. In bad weather it was 3 weeks. They would spin that easy, being solid tyres, right? And then they'd have to wait for bullock teams to come along to pull them. And then of course the 54 flood, there was no bushwork because the bush was that wet, so all the bushmen, be it a trawler, tractor, a truck driver, whatever he had, went on the railway to open the railway line, because of the horrendous damage that was done to the railway line. Grensels that are logging here in these days were logging at Mount Me in Queensland them days. Their trucks done the North Queensland run just to get milk and that to people. They turned their timber trucks into transport trucks, and virtually the same thing happened here, that sort of thing.
All the mills were steam driven around the place, and they had a steam whistle. Most of the areas they blew them at 10 to 7, that means get to work, 7 o'clock you started, and so forth at lunchtime and so forth, the knock-off time. But the steam whistle was fairly loud and could be heard for quite a long while, because they burnt all the waste at the mill. There was always fires around the mill. The boiler was, steam boiler was fueled by wood. Ground was covered with virtually sawdust and bits of bark and things like that. And it was so easy for a spark to get into a pile of dry sawdust and smoulder away until eventually gets a flame, and away it goes. But all mills had the big fires for burning their waste.
Bushfires, of course, was a very big enemy to a bushman. You never got paid till your product got to the railway yard if it was sleepers, or you never got paid till the logs got into the mill. And if you had a bushfire go through, like, you could lose your entire 1 or 2 months' income in one foul swoop. Mills used to finance lots and lots of things. Like even the local fire brigade, the mill would make sure their fire trucks was maintained, because it was very bloody important if that mill caught a light they got there. But sometimes, of course, we're talking about mills burning down, sometimes mills, of course, were burnt to burn down. Get the insurance.